Hello everyone, and you're all very welcome to this panel discussion on care inequalities and the politics of interdependence, hosted by the UCD Equality Studies Centre. My name is Marie Moran and I'm Director of the Equality Studies Centre. I'm really pleased to introduce a fantastic panel of guests to speak to us today. So first up, please welcome Emma Dowling, author of The Care Crisis, What Caused It and How We Can End It, published by Verso this year. Emma is Assistant Professor for the Sociology of Social Change, a wonderful job title, at the University of Vienna, and her work focuses on social justice, financialisation, feminist political economy and social reproduction. I'm also delighted to welcome three members of the CARE Collective, Jo Littler, Catherine Rottenberg and Jamie Hakim. The CARE Collective, which also includes Lynn Segal and Andreas Chatsoudakis, was formed in 2017 as an interdisciplinary research group concerned to understand and address multiple crises of care. And in 2020, they published the CARE Manifesto, which sets out a radical vision for putting care at the heart of our politics and societies. So in addition, Jo Littler is Professor of Social Analysis and Cultural Politics at City University of London and author of, among other things, the brilliant Against Meritocracy. Catherine Rottenberg is Associate Professor in American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham and has also recently published The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism. And Jamie Hakim is Lecturer in Media Studies at UEA and has published Work That Body, Male Bodies in Digital Culture, while also running the ESRC project Digital Intimacies with the Terence Higgins Trust. So the format for today is, we shall first of all hear from Emma and then Catherine, who will introduce the two books respectively. And this will be followed by some short inputs from Jo and Jamie on two core themes of kinship and community. And then following this, the panel has prepared some questions for each other on picking up on issues of care inequality specifically, I believe, and we'll then extend the discussion to all of you participants, and we're interested and eager for you to join in. So please write your questions in the group chat or the questions and answers section of the webinar, and you can write your questions as they occur to you, and I'll try and pick up on them all in the discussion part, or you can simply wait until the discussion element to ask your question. I can also unmute people if you'd prefer to ask your question in not quite in person, but with your own voice. But this won't turn your camera on. And if you want to avail of this option, just attract my attention by letting me know in the chat or the Q&A that you'd like to ask a question. And then I'll unmute you. So finally, this webinar is being recorded and we'll share it on our website and social media networks afterwards. We do aim to finish between say 5 and 1/4 past, not any later than that. So without further ado, we'll get going. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Emma to share hers and to start the discussion. Thanks, Emma.
Can you hear me? Great. Right. Sorry, that's the typical question that one asks first. Can you hear me? Let me just put onto slideshow. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for hosting this event and for inviting me to talk about my new book, The Care Crisis, which was published this year in January by Verso. And what I want to do is just to take you through some of the main themes and arguments of the book. Now, when I started working on this project, which was in 2015, really my aim was to make visible kind of growing care crisis that was engulfing Britain in particular. The focus of the book is the UK, is Britain. And I wanted to make visible sort of the ways in which both access to care and the work of caring have been affected by the global financial crisis of 2008 and the austerity measures that ensued in its wake. And I wanted to show that in the face of growing care deficits, but also in particular growing care inequalities, also, people never actually stopped caring for one another. And so I sort of set out to find out under what conditions people were trying to continue with caring, care workers in care homes, home care workers, social workers, domestic workers, people caring for loved ones. And I wanted to show that the ways in which what they were doing and the ways in which they were trying to care for themselves and one another and do their jobs was actually really impacted by austerity and also by privatization and things like financialization. So that was really kind of what I was trying to do. And as the kind of research unfolded, I saw that there were really attempts emerging to solve a kind of ongoing care crisis, but actually a lot of those were very short term and we're not really getting to grips with the underlying issues that were fueling this care crisis. So of course, when I finished the book, there not only had Brexit happened, but also the pandemic and these issues that I had sort of wanted to be part of putting into the kind of public domain more were really kind of headline news. So that's really the context of the book. And really, I guess the question that motivates the book is what does it mean to look at the economy and economic crisis from the perspective of care? So because we're talking about care inequalities, and because this is also an inequalities seminar, I wanted to kind of hone in on the issue of care inequality and what that might mean. And of course, writing a book about a care crisis, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how I understand what this care crisis is, but writing a book about a care crisis in an already unequal world means that that care crisis is also very unevenly distributed and in many ways also entrenches existing inequalities. And overall, what I show in the book is that not only austerity, the particular austerity measures, but also things like regressive taxation have deepened inequality and distributed wealth upwards in a context of wage stagnation on the one hand and rising dividends to shareholders on the other hand. So for example, an Oxfam report recently put out showed that in the last years, there's been sort of 3% wage rises, whereas dividends to shareholders, have risen by about 31% in advanced economies by comparison. So that really shows the kind of measure of inequality. Also focus on the ways in which vulnerability is manufactured. So not just poverty, but also precarity, insecurity, and the stigma also around things like welfare, being a welfare recipient. Particularly, I also focus on the social care crisis, which of course has also come to particular light in the context of COVID, and the failures of privatization. I also focus on the kind of divisions and the ways in which care workers are often played off against care recipients in a kind of particular sort of service model. For example, I spoke with junior doctors who were on strike in 2016 because of the ways in which their contracts were being changed. And when they went on strike, the then Health Minister Jeremy Hunt branded them as irresponsible for leaving their, leaving patients in the lurch, and at the same time sort of offering the 7-day NHS as an offering to the electorate in ways that weren't actually properly funded, which meant that would work to the detriment of junior doctors, which is why they were on strike. So there's sort of ways in which workers and care recipients are sort of played off against one another. But also that, as we see with more austerity and also privatization, the situation in which those who have enough income can pay for expensive care services, but those who don't end up having to do the work themselves in an unpaid capacity, or simply don't have access to services. So I think these are some of the ways in which care inequalities become further entrenched. I think all in all, for me, the kind of important point here is the kind of specifics of what care means and what care is that as kind of care deficits grow and it becomes more difficult for people to receive and also provide care, also it's the very capacity of people to care and people's compassion and sense of responsibility, sense of commitment to other people and the people that they care about, that is actually drawn on to keep everything going against the odds. So overall, I would say that then what we see, particularly over the last 10 years with an intensifying crisis since 2008, is that those in most need of care, and also those who provide care, are themselves actually bearing the brunt of crisis. So what do I mean by a care crisis? Now, obviously, I didn't come up with the term, and I'm drawing on a wealth of debates and literature that not only posit a growing care crisis in the present, but have also looked looking a sort of longer durée to how this crisis has been, well, it's sort of been there in the background for a long time, but again and again raises its head, also because of the particular ways that a capitalist economy functions. When I say care crisis, what I mean is the inability of people to access the care they need to live well, but also the increasingly difficult conditions under which people provide care, both paid and unpaid. And this is a really key issue also in the context of care, because care and the work of social reproduction is something that is done across both paid and unpaid domains of society. So we always have to think across these different spheres. And also, as I said, there are profound care inequalities that are magnified in a global context. And all in all, I guess we could say that a care crisis is the exhaustion of societal care resources. And of course, we know that these care resources and those who are doing care are often women. Also, the care is racialized labour markets, and also heavily classed. So these societal care resources are exhausted, but they are also not equally distributed. Now, there are some underlying causes for this care crisis that, on the one hand, as I said, specifically in the book, I'm looking at the mechanisms of the period after the global financial crisis, which is the focus of the book. But the causes of a care crisis are actually much sort of longer than that period. On the one hand, what we have seen is a kind of undermining of a reproductive deal between capital and labour with globalization, and also with financialization. So there's a kind of ways in which a dependency on a particular national labour force on behalf of capital it's not entirely become entirely obsolete, not in the slightest, but it's sort of undermined somewhat if capital can move to other places, production can move to other places where labour power is cheaper, where working conditions are different, but also financialization, so the ways in which financial markets become more important as a source of profitability, that also undermines this relationship. Of course, we also have rising care needs due to demographic changes, in particular an aging society, people, more older people, and a sort of diminishing younger population, greater female labour market participation, particularly since the 1970s and 1980s. This greater female labour market participation, however, hasn't gone hand in hand with an actual real change in the sexual division of labour. Also, a primacy of waged work, while also there is a wage stagnation. So what I mean by that is people have to spend a lot of time, houses have to spend a lot of time earning the income that they need to live, at the same time when wages have stagnated, meaning that also one wage is not sufficient to actually provide for a household. So wage work becomes more and more important. Austerity and welfare state retrenchment, of course, part of this, so cuts not only to social security, but also cuts to public infrastructures, social infrastructures, in particular in Britain, local council funding. The privatisation and commodification of care are part of this, as well as a sort of underlying politics of personal responsibility. You are responsible for yourself, and this kind of undermining also of collective solidarity. Now, what I then look at in the book are the ways in which new fixes are sought for these kind of ongoing crisis tendencies. And a care fix is sort of the term I came up with to describe these. is really about the kind of short-term fixes that displace rather than resolve the crisis. Based on a tension between, in a capitalist economy, there is a sort of need for this labour power, but also the cost of its reproduction is needs to be kept as low as possible. And so the kind of cost of that reproduction of that labour power gets offloaded to unpaid realms and the sort of invisible realms of society. There's also a kind of market expansion and a pursuit of profitability that engulfs whole areas of care, which has ramifications, and particularly around the devaluation of care work. And one of the things that's also important in this care fix is that these processes need in some way also to be explained and legitimated. And here, some ideologies of caring come into play about what, whose role it is to care, also what standards of care might be appropriate. And also the boundaries of what counts as care get drawn and redrawn. So just very briefly, what are some examples of care fixes that that I identify? Well, one obvious one is austerity, where cuts happen. You find professionals who have to compensate for those cuts by doing overtime, going beyond the call of duty, more unpaid care work and informal care work being done in families, volunteers step in to plug gaps, but also there's a displacement of costs. So if someone can't access local social care services, then they might find themselves having to go to A&E, and so there's not a way in which the costs sort of miraculously disappear, but they get shifted to different parts of society. There's a devaluation of labour occurs, a particularly severe situation in the care sector with low wages and not very good working conditions, but also kind of techno fixes like new kinds of platforms that offer gig care, so gigified care services that promise to resolve the crisis by offering, by people being able to find care services, particularly for the home, so childcare and these sorts of things. And this kind of platform economy, of course, also being very interesting for capital investment. There's an expansion of commodified care, and also a rise in this kind of self-care, idea of self-care as a sort of asset management. Not only you're your most important asset that you take to market, but you're also, you have to take care of yourself, because what are you going to do if you have no longer have the power to earn an income? And particularly something I spend a lot of time on in the book is looking at processes of financialization and public-private partnerships. So financialization of care homes and things like that, entry of private equity into the care home sector, and so forth. So just to finish then, I also set out some suggestions for how to escape this care fix, and think about how we might design an economy and have a politics that actually addresses this crisis more fundamentally. And one of my main arguments is that we really need to allocate much more time and many more resources to care in order to increase the societal value of care and make sure that people are provided for, and both workers are able to provide care under better conditions, and people get the care that they need. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was really fascinating and brilliant that you ended up kind of introducing some of the potential resolutions to the fixes. So I'm sure that will come up for more discussion later, but I think we'll move straight away now to Catherine, who's going to introduce the book, The Care Manifesto.
Thanks, Marie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here and to be part of this conversation on care inequalities and the politics of interdependence. And it's a real pleasure to be in conversation with Emma. And I want to thank the UCD Equality Studies Centre and Marie for all she's done in organizing this event, and thanks to Ashley. And what I thought I would do, and the way I thought I would begin is just to say a few more words about the CARE Collective, how the collective came into being, and how we as a collective understand this notion, the notion of care, before I'm going to hand over the screen to my co-authors. So as Marie said, the CARE Collective was created as a reading group in the fall of 2017, when a few colleagues got together to think about the notion of care from a range of perspectives. And we wanted to try and make sense of what we saw as the many inequalities and the multiple crises of care already engulfing the world. So we wanted to think about rising inequality everywhere, economic inequalities, endless war, the refugee crisis, and of course, looming over everything, imminent environmental catastrophe. And we met for 2 years, reading, discussing, and debating, and often disagreeing. And then we decided that we wanted to write a manifesto. And that's what became the CARE Manifesto, the Politics of Interdependence. Now, we began writing in 2019, so we could never have anticipated how grimly urgent COVID would make our manifesto. And in the manifesto, we argue that the current global crisis is indeed a crisis of care. It's the result of decades of policies prioritizing profit over people and the reduction of more and more domains of our lives to a market logic. And we've heard a lot about this from Emma. And as Emma said, we've witnessed years of austerity measures. We've witnessed intensified deregulation and privatization. And these processes have occurred alongside the devaluing of care practices and care work. And this is in large part due to CARE's historical association to and with women and the domestic sphere. And so all of this has meant that neoliberal nation states, and particularly countries like the UK and the US, have been utterly unable and sometimes even unwilling to cope swiftly or effectively with the spread of coronavirus. And so on the one hand, what we argue is that COVID-19 has dramatically and horrifically exposed what we call the reigning politics of carelessness. And on the other hand, the pandemic has also dramatically exposed our profound interdependence. The pandemic has highlighted our shared vulnerability and that the need for care is part and parcel of the human condition. So in the manifesto, what we argue is that if the pandemic has, or until now has taught us anything so far, it's that we are in urgent need of a radically new politics that puts care front and center. And we draw on scholars like Joan Tronto and Judith Butler, and our approach in the CARE Manifesto is one that understands care as being necessary across every distinct scale of life. So we begin by diagnosing the interconnected nature of the current reign of carelessness, and then we travel from the global dimensions that have produced the climate crisis and economies that put profit over people through careless states and communities to how the banality of carelessness affects our interpersonal intimacies. But then we travel outward, scaling up from the interpersonal to the planetary in order to outline caring alternatives to our contemporary condition of carelessness. And Jamie and Joe are going to be presenting some of these caring alternatives, scaling up a bit, as it were. So we use this structure of scales because we want to show how our capacities to care are interdependent and can only be realized and cultivated by avowing these interconnections. And one of the main premises of the manifesto is that only once we acknowledge the challenges of our shared dependence as human beings, as well as our vulnerability, irreducible differences, and our many ambivalences around care, can we fully value the resources necessary to promote the capabilities of everyone? So a caring politics is one that recognizes the intricacies and ambivalences of human interactions. And we also argue that such a politics is better poised to enhance democratic processes on all levels of society. So what all this means is that we need to expand our understanding and politics of care. In the manifesto, we argue that care cannot be understood only as the hands-on care people do when directly looking after the physical and emotional needs of others, but rather the vision that we offer is one that advances a model of universal care, where care is understood as an enduring social capacity and practice involving the nurturing of all that is necessary for the welfare and flourishing of human and non-human life. So care is our individual and common ability to provide the political, the social, the material, and the emotional conditions that allow for the greatest possible number of people and living creatures on this planet, along with the planet itself, to thrive. And so now I'm going to hand over the screen to Jamie.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Marie and Ashley, for kind of facilitating this discussion. As Catherine's just been describing, one of the things we do in the manifesto is talk about care at different scales. And today I'm going to be talking about care at the scale of kinship. So looking at personal, intimate and familial relationships. Now, the way that care is currently organised at this scale is insufficient in a number of ways. It overburdens mothers with childcare responsibilities. When middle-class mothers outsource these responsibilities, they tend to fall into the hands of hyper-exploited migrant women, as Emma was referring to in her talk. And on a political level, we're not really encouraged to care for anyone beyond our families. This model of care, we argue, has led in part to the rise of right-wing populism, exemplified by that image of Melania Trump visiting child refugee detention centres with the words, "I really don't care," literally painted on the back of her jacket. So we began to look to different times and places for alternative models of care that might replace those that prevail today, and we discussed those at length in the manifesto. One of the alternative models of care that we were particularly struck by came out of AIDS activism from the 1980s. There were debates at the time about the role that gay men's so-called promiscuity played in the transmission of HIV in the early days of the epidemic. The activist and academic Douglas Crimp argued that despite common sense assumptions that the promiscuity of post-Stonewall sexual cultures spread HIV, what these cultures actually meant for the epidemic was that gay men multiplied and experimented with sexual practices beyond the penetrative sex that was a major route of HIV transmission. In this regard, promiscuity, he argued, led to safer sex practices that were in fact saving lives and not ending them, as some at the time would have it. We then began to discuss grassroots care initiatives during the early days of the epidemic from the likes of organisations such as ACT UP, Buddies and the Terence Higgins Trust. These initiatives sprung up precisely because the neoliberal, neoconservative state, the market, and the biological family failed so spectacularly at caring for people living with and eventually dying from AIDS, providing all sorts of hands-on care for those living with the virus, as well as demanding the society care about them. In this spirit, we might call the multiplication and experimentation of forms of care beyond the state, the market, and the family, promiscuous care. We argue that at the level of kinship, we need to act in line with an ethics of promiscuous care, multiplying and experimenting with modes of caring for, about, and with beyond the shriveled forms of care that are currently hegemonic. What this means in practical terms is that our common sense needs to change around who should be caring for whom and with what resources. We must normalise an egalitarian model of care where everyone can care for everyone, not just hyper-exploited, feminised and racialised subjects, and that a radically democratic state must resource these experimental caring arrangements. Childcare, elderly care and palliative care must be taken seriously and not just treated as commodities for neoliberal capitalism. We must proliferate and expand our circles of care beyond our families and those designated as our fellow citizens. And if we're to stop both the mounting refugee and environmental crisis, we must reimagine the stranger and the non-human world as if they were kin. So for us, promiscuous care is really about the question of who we care for. And advocating for an ethics of promiscuous care is a first step in building the psychic infrastructure of a new society that has universal care at its heart. Thank you, and I'm now going to pass it over to Jo.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks, everyone. It's great to be here, even virtually. And I look forward to hearing more about care and inequality in Ireland and beyond, because I see there's people here from Denmark and the US too. So I'm going to talk about communities and ask, what do caring communities look like? Well, they don't all look the same. And in the manifesto, we highlight a lot of different progressive examples of practice, past and present. But we do think that they tend to have certain features that together create what can be called social infrastructures of care. They will always involve shared space by creating more public and green space, more cycle lanes, for example, public transport, pedestrian and play streets, parks and community centres. And they will always involve shared resources, whether such as, for example, free public broadband, ubiquitous water fountains, and the sharing not only of books through public libraries, but things like kitchen hardware, garden tools, and all the toys, all those kind of equipment that people use once or twice a year, or just for a brief time. And there are plenty of grassroots examples of these libraries of things already in existence. And they will also facilitate shared activities, such as in how the GLC, the Greater London Council of the 1980s, was so creative in democratising arts and culture, in creating community media and festivals which were genuinely diverse, as well as the newer forms of municipalism, from Preston to Mississippi to Barcelona, which are facilitating the rebirth of high streets, promoting co-ops and pushing for affordable housing, as they offer models of what's sometimes called community wealth building, and make international alliances, such as through the transnational gathering Fearless Cities. And we might also think of the great mutual aid neighbourhood projects that have sprung up during the pandemic. So we think local experiments are very important in creating caring communities, but so is scaling them up. And here we might refer to how, for example, the women's liberation creches of the 1970s led to networks of local nurseries, or how the Tredegar Mutual Aid Society in Wales at the end of the 19th century and the provisions of the early London County Council were the models that were scaled up to form the post-war NHS. So to do this kind of scaling needs political engagement and it needs resource. And here, as Emma said, reversing the cuts accelerated by austerity politics is crucial. So in the UK, local government spending has been cut in by over half during the past decade. We've lost 17,000 NHS hospital beds. That clearly needs reversing. But also it's critically important that that resource is shared and not just siphoned off to unaccountable private companies, as we saw happening with the test and trace system in the UK, or Trump's huge donations to oil companies using COVID relief money in the US. So in other words, expanding the commons, or what we collectively own in terms of space, resources and democratic engagement, is really key. And this will involve insourcing as well as outsourcing. It will involve reversing the privatisation of schools and hospitals, and it will involve bringing back care homes into public ownership, as they've done recently in Canada, in British Columbia, or whether in the form of creating expanding cooperative systems of social care, like the very successful Buurtzorg system in the Netherlands, where instead of having multiple carers working brutal 15-minute shifts and not dealing with the same person, you have a dedicated group of people working on an ongoing cooperative basis to address the health and social care needs of a particular person. So all this kind of organisation means that no one can profit from pain, and that the work of hands-on caring is materially as well as symbolically valued through better pay and conditions. So in other words, we're advocating rolling back neoliberalism in favour of universal basic services, in favour of a mixed economy of collective ownership and cooperative activities. Because doing this also means that we're extending people's ability to participate in the world, in deepening local democracy, enabling us to care and be cared for. So we present this as a kind of brief template for how we might create caring communities, how we can create caring communities, and how we can really take back control in a sustainable and pleasurable rather than proto-fascistic disaster capitalist form. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the three members of the CARE Collective. That was really fascinating, really interesting, covered a whole range of issues that I think will probably people will want to ask more about in the discussion. But before we move to open it up to the floor, I think there was going to be one or two questions that you wanted to ask of each other, given that you're working in and around the same set of topics, but maybe from slightly different angles or different perspectives. So who would like to start? Was it?
I'm happy to ask Emma, if
Right.
that's okay. Emma, is that okay?
Emma's muted, but it's okay.
Okay, it's okay. I need the go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for you. And my question is, I mean, there's so much overlap between the Care Manifesto and your book, The Care Crisis. And one of the things that struck me in particular was the critical and the ways in which you distinguish between social reproduction and care. And in your book, you argue that care work should be understood as one crucial and distinct aspect of the labor of social reproduction. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about why this distinction is so important, and how you distinguish the two terms.
Thanks very much, Catherine, for that question, because indeed, it's certainly the case that a lot of the time also these terms are sort of used interchangeably, and it seemed to me that it was important to make a distinction between, on the one hand, social reproduction, which I argue is, well, not just me, but I'm drawing on a sort of whole tradition of feminist political economy. It's a sort of functional economic category that's used to analyze the ways in which productive and reproductive activities are separated and their arrangements within capitalism. And particularly, it's a term that feminists use to give all of those activities, many of which occur in unpaid in households, that make sure that labour power is available to be put to work for a wage, in what we come to think of the sort of economy proper. And so it's that analysis that understands, that tries to make sense of these unpaid realms, and all of that work that's done, not just care work, cooking, cleaning, and all sorts of things, that actually is the condition for any kind of value to be economic value to be produced in the economy. So that's that term, and also that within capitalism, as I said already, there is this tension, or even contradiction, if you want to use that term, between the need for labour power to be reproduced and to be available and also educated in certain ways, etc. But then also that's a cost that is within capitalism is in particular ways then kept low by offloading that cost. And we can also think of something like the welfare state as a kind of mediation of that relationship and of that tension. Now, care, on the other hand, I posit as an ethical social relationship, which based on feelings of affection and a sense of service, both requiring and producing sympathetic attachments within social bonds. That's the kind of definition that I use. So caring activities are the act of tending to the emotional and physical needs of others, but it's also something that has a kind of qualitative dimension, and it is also something that changes over time and in different contexts. And that's also why in the book I try to get to grips with the ways in which these changes occur, and the ways in which also what constitutes care and what doesn't constitute care, and particularly what constitutes care work and what doesn't, gets redefined in order to exploit it, and or defined and redefined in order to exploit it, and also to instrumentalize it. So one example would be the kind of ideologies of caring, whether that's ways in which sort of women are designated as particularly disposed towards caring, but also ways in which sort of civic engagement is drawn on to kind of plug gaps in cuts, and so, or how also within the care sector, care work, say travel time is not paid for because that's not actual care in home care. So I really I want to make these distinctions between the two terms, so that we can, on the one hand, analyze the ways in which capital draws on unpaid work, but also so that we can sort of have a lens through which to understand the kinds of ethical and effective relations and the precise shape and form they take in any given context or situation. Of course, overall, I'm kind of grappling with also what the question of what it would actually mean to try and foster the right social material practices to bring about more mutuality and trust, but care in that respect has this kind of differentiation from social reproduction.
Thanks, Emma. That was really helpful. It clarified a lot for me anyway, because of the overlap between those two terms. But I think the way you kind of spelled that out was really helpful. Did you have a question you wanted to put to your...
I have several, but I'm going to pick one. Yeah, thanks again, Catherine, for your question. And you're right in saying that there is a lot of overlap in our two books. And I think when each of us sort of read each other's work, we kind of sat there and thought, wow, you know, kind of there are so many ways in which we're grappling with similar issues, not least A, we're not the only ones, lots of people are, and B, because it's really a sort of issue of the moment. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because in your work, and certainly in the manifesto, one of the main arguments is that care should be put at the heart of everything, should be the sort of starting point, the point of departure that we begin from. And so I was wondering whether you thought there could also be any dangers of putting quite a normative prescription of people to care, and maybe also quite a broad definition of that at the heart of all societal institutions, whether that's as a political program for achieving change or as a social reality if and when change has been achieved. And if I may, I'd like to tack on a little follow-up question to that, because historically, of course, large parts of progressive movements have focused more on liberation rather than normative prescriptions, also liberation from oppression, from exploitation, and so forth. So do you see also that what you're speaking to is and the program that you're advocating as having liberatory potentials as well?
I think it's going to be between you and me for now, and then I'll let Joe and Jamie respond if they want to. But first of all, thanks so much for the question. I'm not sure that I would say that struggles for liberation do not contain normative prescriptions, even if they're not always explicitly outlined. I think that the notion of liberation are always and also based on normative understandings of repression, oppression, and freedom. And I also do think that here I would make the distinction between a political pamphlet, which is what the manifesto is, and everyday struggles and movements. Not that that distinction is a clear-cut one, but what I think you mean, and I think it's a really provocative question, is that liberation movements are often more amorphous and they don't necessarily have a detailed template for how to achieve their goals, right? Or necessarily what an alternative world might look like. And I think that that's precisely why we wrote the manifesto. I think that for us, we were really interested in proffering an alternative vision. And of course, it's drawn from many different traditions, and it is a political platform. The manifesto is meant as a provocation, and it's meant to be polemical in many ways. And so I think that another part of my answer would be that, again, a large part of our motivation for coming together and for writing this manifesto was that we really felt at the time that we were inundated with dystopian visions of the future, you know, The Handmaid's Tale, all of these dystopian visions. And we really wanted to get together a collaborative utopian counter narrative. And we thought that this could, in and of itself, be a kind of political intervention. And that's, in a sense, we were following Naomi Klein's insight that no is not enough anymore. Look at the world around us. We need a vision, an alternative vision, a different narrative that, you know, not everything is hopeless and we cannot afford to fall into despair. So I guess more than anything else, these templates were meant to contribute to the ongoing conversations around care. So from the long tradition of the feminist ethics of care to the work by the Women's Budget Group and to so many others like your work. So it's really an intervention into this conversation. And finally, and then I'll hand it over to Joe and to Jamie, I think that ultimately what we try to do in the manifesto is to provide a very capacious notion of care, one that, while universal, and again, it's in scare quotes, is open and expansive, and we leave it that way on purpose so that we can leave it open to democratic contestations in the future, and that these kinds of notions of what care should or can mean and how to organize care at these different scales of life can be left permanently open. But one of the things, and here's kind of the provocation back at you, is that if we think about a caring institution, as we understand it, as ultimately one in which the people who establish, create, maintain, work in it are the priority, and where human thriving rather than profit is the end goal, is that being overly prescriptive? And so that's a question. I can leave it at that. So.
Thank you.
Jamie or Joe, did you want to come in at that point, or?
I mean, I'll just very quickly build on what Catherine said, because I think that one thing that perhaps the term universal care doesn't automatically communicate is how attentive we are and how attentive the manifesto is to difference. And so this kind of speaks to kind of normative prescriptions. I mean, what we acknowledge is that care, with all its problems and all its ambivalences, is just fundamental to the flourishing of all human and non-human life. And in that respect, you know, that's its universality, I suppose. But what that looks like at each of the different scales, and what that looks like for different people, and how, you know, the different inequities which, you know, Emma, you so beautifully, you know, outlined, is redressed, is very kind of specific and different. And so, you know, certainly when I'm talking about, you know, the multiplication and experimentation of kind of forms and kinships of care, forms of care and caring kinships, what that is an invitation to think differently about care, depending on what your situation is, right? So one of the things that often we get asked is, when it, you know, mothers who are already overburdened with care, how do they have the time and the capacity to care about everything else? Well, that isn't what we're saying, right? We're not saying that mothers who are overburdened should suddenly also care about refugees, should also, I mean, in the same way that they care about their children, right? It's that there are different forms of care, and how those are distributed will be different. And what we're encouraging is kind of a greater form of participatory democracy, where people are able to kind of decide how to access and use resources for their specific caring needs. So I think that there is a normative prescription to a degree, but how that manifests itself at these different scales and according to different social groups looks very different. And it's a way of kind of thinking about care that's attentive to those differences, I suppose, which, yeah, just wanted to add to what Catherine was saying.
I don't have anything to add. I think we should open it up to the audience.
Okay, great, because there's 5 questions that have come in so far. There's 2 questions for you, Emma, that are really just kind of shorter questions about whether you've looked at, I mean, they're short as long as you want them, but whether you've looked at techno-fixes and have you looked at the bureaucratization of the process of care. Then there's 2 questions in a way that we could put to the full group. One is really about the intersection of care and social class, and then the second one is about the intersection of care and disability. And finally, we have a question from Ursula Barry on working with the Citizens Assembly on a statutory right to care. So I would invite, if any of those people who had the longer questions wanted to actually put it themselves to the panelists, now is your time to raise your hand and I can unmute you. Otherwise, I think everybody can actually see the questions and could maybe just put it to the panel to answer them as they see fit. So I don't see any hands raised yet, although there might be people considering being a bit braver, thinking about their questions in the interim. So over to you again, to the panel, whether you'd like to take the question about the intersection of care and class, or care and disability. And then I don't know if you can see the question in the chat, which is a more specific question about recommendation for a statutory right to care.
Yeah, I guess we can talk about the class question from Catriona. So Catriona, you've written that people in lower socioeconomic groups cannot often afford care, and the kind of problems around that and the potential solutions. And yeah, absolutely, I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be investment in communities. There needs to be far greater investment on multiple levels for care services in very, extensive, both extensive and nuanced ways. So, I mean, there are a lot of very interesting plans and work and thinking around this at the moment. So the Women's Budget Group, for example, produced a document about a care-led recovery after COVID, which is, talking about how to prioritise investment in care, and also kind of positioning it, interestingly, as a environmentally friendly, more green option, in that if you invest in care and care services and care provision rather than infrastructure and roads and more pollution, you're automatically contributing to the environmental good. So yes, in short, and also, I mean, it's just multi-scalar really. So you can think about how the Labour Party put forward a national care service as policy as part of its last manifesto, which needs to be more fully fleshed out. So there's that, and there's also suggestions that are being developed by different groups internationally, like the LEAP is doing a lot of work, and yeah, there's a lot of really interesting development and thinking, I think, around that. And it's also been going on a long time. So you could think about how one of the issues that we've been talking about is the kind of problematic of childcare, which is partly, a major contributing factor to that problem is overwork. So the policies around the 4-day week can be caring policies as well that can be used to solve some of these problems around the time squeeze, as well as problems that are classed. So yes, in short, more infrastructure, caring infrastructural investment on multiple levels in a nuanced way is very important.
Thanks, Jo. And I see that Marita Woods, who asked the question about the intersection between care and disability, has her hand raised. So Marita, would you like to put that question to the group yourself, or elaborate on it before they respond?
Well, yes, I'm somebody who was a carer. I was also in equality studies. I did a master's, and I did it on people who were in my position, who were looking after a severely disabled child at home. Now, I have to say, services improved slightly since my day in the 1980s and 90s, but only slightly. If you keep your child at home, and with COVID, if you don't keep her at home, you won't see her at all. You are basically in charge of what happens. And the people who are supposed to be giving you care, and many of them are very good, will only give you care on their terms. A woman in my research said to me, they don't give you what you want, they give you what they intend to give you. They work out what they intend, and then they give it to you. And you have to make do with it, whether it suits your child or not. And the question I put then was, who decides where people need a lot of care? It's one thing when you're looking after children. You maybe have 2 kids, you have 5 years of intense caring, you have 10 years of less intense caring, and they're grown up. If you have somebody with a severe disability, they may not ever grow up or grow out of a need for care. And, they have a right to some choice over how they're cared for, without, having carers who are dying of, overwork. And at present, the amount of care hours that disabled people can get from the HSE are, not sufficient for their needs. They're better than they were, but that's like saying that a cup of water is better than nothing at all. It's not very, very good at, And I know about theory, I've read theory, but I don't see these questions addressed in theory. And it sort of annoys me slightly, if you don't mind me saying so. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Marita. I'll put that to the panel then. I don't know who'd like to maybe respond.
Perhaps could I come in on that? Thanks very much, Marita, for sharing that with us, and for posing that problem and long-standing and ongoing problem. I think I think this is a really important issue, and one that, of course, also disability rights movements have have always stressed as well, that certainly it's really important that people who are cared for, and also the informal carers involved are have a say about what that care looks like, and also how that care is organized. I think it's really important. And I think here you're right, there's a kind of combination of not enough resources and a very top-down model that leads to some of the problems that you mentioned. And I think here it's really important to stress that care isn't this kind of one-way top-down thing, that actually it involves what some people also talk about as co-production between everybody involved, and that could be an emphasis also to ask for and to demand that things are different. And of course that also goes together with the necessary resources. And I think one of the things that happened in England is that there was, under the sort of premise of greater choice, there was the introduction of personalised budgets where people could buy either equipment that they needed or hire a personal assistant. But that brought with it also all sorts of problems around then what kind of relationship was instilled between the sort of employee. You then become an employer in your own home. That comes with a whole sort of new set of issues. But then also, because not enough resources were made available, actually the assessments meant that people weren't actually getting the sufficient, and not always getting it in the ways that they require. So I think this kind of idea of co-production, but also thinking about how resources are allocated, and these kinds of community nursing models that are being developed, I think are really, really useful here. And I think it kind of connects also to the question about the rights, about a sort of rights-based approach, which I think is in many ways really helpful, but at the same time it has to come hand in hand with demands for more resources and the involvement of everyone concerned. And of course these are political questions. They don't get solved in theory, but obviously we need movements that can make these demands. But I think that could be one possibility, a way of thinking about it. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, yeah, thanks for that. I think you raise a very important point. And I mean, we do believe in the value of theory, but the manifesto continuously talks about concrete examples to help us think about kind of current issues. And so the issue, the one that I'm thinking about is the one that I talked about and just touched on, but didn't perhaps talk about the kind of the case study as in-depthly as perhaps I could, was about ACT UP and about patients organising precisely because they weren't getting any care. In the early days of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s in the US and the UK, people were literally left to die and were left uncleaned, and bodies were found, after having not been touched for weeks in hospitals. So, and there were political movements that were making the sorts of kind of very radical demands that I think that you're talking to, and that continue to be important demands now. And so in the manifesto, we do talk about kind of concrete political examples where people had to make demands about the sorts of care that they needed and that they didn't get. And only really to say that we completely agree with you, that, that's obviously an absolutely, the manifesto has got lots of examples of bottom-up care where people begin to make, and successfully to some degree, demands for the sorts of care that they receive. So thank you for raising that issue. We didn't get to talk about it.
Thanks both for your responses. I'm just keeping in mind time and the fact that there's still some more questions coming in, so I'll just draw your attention to those, and you can continue responding to any ones you haven't responded to yet or the new ones that are coming in. And again, if anybody who's now writing questions in the questions and answers wants to speak to the panel, please raise your hand and I'll see you, and I'll be able to enable your speech function on this. But the first question is from Fionn and Jonathan Angus. I'm sure people can see it. A question about an adult son with Down syndrome winning a personal budget from the HSE. So the HSE is our Health Service Executive, just the panelists who may not be aware of the Irish acronyms. And he heard with the money to support them in living semi-independently, and now we are being told that the HSE is banning the employment of family members. I suppose that's something really, again, about the intersection of the kind of care that happens in a family space and then paid care work, and what kinds of tensions are there. And then a second question from Carly Bailey on the legacy of the charity model, and maybe there's positive and negative elements to that. The charity model in an Irish context, if you've seen international news at all at the moment, is not something people who live in Ireland are at all proud of, given what has happened in history of kind of care homes run by the state in an Irish context. So maybe any responses to either of those questions, and I'm conscious, Emma, that there's one or two early questions for you that you might still like to come back to.
So I'll just say a few very short comments and then leave it open. Just in terms of the previous discussion, I think that one of, there are two processes that need to happen. One is the democratization of decision-making, right? And the other is about the resourcing. And I think they have to go together. And I think that then leads to the question about top-down and even charity, where the idea and what we struggled with in trying to come up with a kind of completely transformed welfare state where the issues and problems about top-down care or without having any kind of participation on the part of the community. How do we think about breaking those kinds of patterns, or the kind of endemic racism and sexism that were embedded in the welfare state post World War II? And so again, now I'm losing my train of thought. Those are the kinds of questions that we raise, and we try to think about how we can both, how do we expand the possibilities of participatory democracy? And clearly the only way to do that is through resourcing, but not just resourcing from the state to the communities, but also having the community and kinship communities make these kinds of decisions in relation to the other kinds of interdependencies within a certain geographical or spatial, it's the same thing, group. So in terms of charity, I would just say that one of the problems with charity is that the model is basically in many ways there as a Band-Aid in order to patch over or to the failures of the state. And so how then can you, my answer would be, how do we make charity no longer, how do we render it no longer necessary? And how do we talk about justice rather than charity? I mean, so.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I agree with you. I would emphasize that it's definitely true, isn't it, that disabled people have been one of the constituencies most hardest hit by austerity, as Frances Ryan details so brilliantly in her book Crippled. And it's also the case that a lot of disabled activists and theorists have been pivotal to rethinking the meaning of dependency and trying to break the stigma of dependency and kind of think about a more mutual, interdependent model of human support and care. So that's something important as well, I think. And in relation to that, relates to the discussion of co-production, doesn't it? And how you can create welfare states that are not only more extensive and more well-funded and not siphoning off money to private cronies, but are, kind of have a kind of cooperative, co-productive dimension to them. So for example, you might think about Hilary Cotham's recent work in which she tries to think through some of those problems. And yeah, in relation to charity, I think that's kind of interesting because the charity sector itself is quite diverse, and there's a lot of way in which it's been put under a lot of pressure to be neoliberalized over the past decade as well. So I'm kind of acutely conscious that there must be very different geographical social resonances in different places that need to be picked apart.
Perhaps I could come in there on that point, because I think that one of the issues, though, that I think we see precisely with a kind of retrenchment of public infrastructures is that the charity model, not only in the sense of volunteering or the sort of voluntary, but also in the sense of a kind of top-down patronizing model of the sort of Victorian ideas that those that have help those that don't have. I mean, I think those are really problematic conceptions of care that I think you quite rightly also in the Care Manifesto argue that, you know, we need to think about care differently. So I think when we refer to the charity sector, that is something quite diverse, but I think this kind of notion of charity and what that means is also problematic in terms of what a progressive social justice based understanding of care would look like. I wanted to speak to the issue about that Fiona and Jonathan Angus raised, because I think what you're pointing to is, of course, I'm really sorry also for the frustrations that you must experience in these kind of constant changes and ways in which it seems that there is never really a sort of sufficient care in place, and there's changes and things happening all the time that don't go far enough to actually provide a solid basis for care. And then you have one arrangement and then that gets changed again, and I can imagine that you feel very undermined. I think the issue that you raise is, in my thinking, about kind of what are the structures put in place also to support you in the caring that you're doing, and perhaps the personal budget model goes some way to doing that, and now you find yourself in a situation where the rules change again, and you're not deemed to be the I don't think it's a case that you're not deemed to be the right person to be doing that caring, but that there is sort of these constant restructurings of this care system that seems to be perennially in crisis. And I think that's a kind of epiphenomenon of that. And so I guess it's sort of a fundamental question that won't help your specific situation, but I don't think I could speak to that anyway, because I don't know the specifics of Ireland. But I think it's more this question of how do we, what kinds of resources need to be put in place so that also you as an informal carer can work together on an equal footing also with professional carers that would be involved with the care for your son.
Okay, thanks for all your responses there. We're nearing the end of our time, so I just wanted to throw it out again to the audience to see if there's anybody with any burning questions that they haven't managed to raise, or to ask our panel. Is there anything that you wanted to reflect on the end of the discussion, or any questions you wanted to come back to before we finish up? So
I would just invite anybody who posed a question or made a comment and that we've sort of answered or spoken to or responded to, if they have anything to add or respond to us, perhaps.
So people are quite shy about raising their hand to unmute themselves,
or even just in the chat.
In the chat, I think here's another one. Question from Carol Callagher. Challenges of universalizing care and yet making policymakers more aware of specific and heterogeneous care needs. Care audits, and is neoliberalism asking us to account for care in society as opposed to recognizing it as universal? And I have a raised hand from Carly Bailey, who asked the question about charity. So Carly, I can allow you to talk as well if you'd like to come in at this point.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks everybody. It's a really, really interesting discussion, and particularly, I guess, timely at the moment. Although I suppose for a lot of us that are either carers or are cared for, perhaps not so much, but for a lot of us, I think COVID, it's really brought it up. But I appreciated the responses around that legacy of charity model, and I appreciate that it's probably different perhaps in different areas, different jurisdictions, different countries. I think those of us in Ireland, though, will be acutely aware of I guess, that legacy. You talked about it being a plaster. I think it was talking about it being a plaster. I think for us, and most of us would agree, it's been more than a plaster. It's state never stepped up, and it was a hangover from sort of taking over from independence and that kind of thing. So I just wonder, is there anything that we can, it just seems to be very, very difficult to disentangle. And that separation of church and state, I think, is something that's still really important and a piece of work that possibly needs to be done. But just to ask again about, I suppose, that, but like, I just really appreciate the discussion. It's just a really interesting conversation. Thanks for putting it together, Marie and co.
Thanks, Carly. So I think we'll just bring it back to the panel one last time. I had a very quick question, which I may not have time to get to, but it's just really about picking up on ambivalences towards the welfare state, very strong ambivalences on the left, even, where in some circles it's seen as a kind of mode of legitimating capitalism, yet in I suppose in a context where we're not seeing any immediate anti-capitalist mass mobilization, it seems there must be some kind of argument for working very closely with the welfare state, or Joe, in terms of what you raised, sort of a very much reimagined welfare state along alternative lines, but also the role of the state in redistributing wealth. And I think we need a powerful state to redistribute wealth, to equalise the resources that we've all spoken about are so necessary to equalising relations of care and solidarity. So, and then I think there's a final question in the questions and answers, and it's Katrina coming back, just again talking about the kind of the history in an Irish context around the relationship of the state to adults with mental health disabilities. So we're running out of time, so maybe I'll just return it to the panel for some final comments on any or all of that as you see fit.
I'm happy to briefly say something. There's so much that has been raised, and clearly we could continue talking for a long time. So also apologies for being brief, where I think we could talk for a lot longer. I wanted to pick up on this point about I think there's a whole complex that has come out in the questions around the relationship between welfare state and communities, and on the one hand I would stress that actually part of what needs to happen is more time and space for also self-organized initiatives and mutual aid, but at the same time also we need systems that are rights-based, that are entitlement-based, so that we're not relying on affinities and existence of people that are happy to be involved with caring for each other on a kind of voluntary basis to be the basis of our care in society. So I think for me it's like thinking those two together, which has to do also with neoliberalism and also with capitalism and the ways in which the economy is geared towards producing profit and economic value, and that's where we also need a quite fundamental rethink, and then that relates to the point that you make, Marie, about the welfare state and its ambivalences. And so I think here that's absolutely right in many instances, but also we do need a system of entitlement and redistribution of wealth and distribution of the wealth that we produce in society. So I think democratizing that, and care in the community, of course, in Britain was an excuse also for cuts, and people fell through the cracks, and care in the community also was part of a privatization agenda. So it's also about redefining what we mean by these terms and demanding the right kind of structures while also having the time and space to care more for each other. So we have to think of these strategies together.
Thanks so much, Emma. That's really helpful. Joe?
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree. I think, I come from that tradition of being in and against the state. So like most of us. So I think it's really useful to try, in particular, to try and find examples of progressive practice on whatever scale that might be, however long ago that might be, wherever that might be, because they offer, examples of how development and progressive care can actually be brought into being. So I think part of our job and what we were trying to do in the manifesto is to try and glean different instances and hold them up and think through how they might be used to inspire people, and to offer examples that we could work with and towards and blend and synthesize for different futures. So that is, I think, an important part of what we need to do around care, to find examples that have existed of care that we can take forward. But also, the solutions are multi-scalar, aren't they? Just like the way in which we tackle the question of the state and how it can be reformed, how it can be improved, how it can be coexisted with and alongside. So, when we're thinking about care, we need to think about alternatives on every level as well, from the psychological relationships we have to it, to the self-care products we're encouraged to buy, to the global alternatives, to a kind of universal imaginary that doesn't care about the environment and wants us to only care about ourselves.
Thanks so much, Joe. Jamie, did you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I mean, I think I'm only kind of repeating what Joe and Emma are saying, and that yeah, I mean, I think that the traditions that Manifesto comes out of are actually as critical of the welfare state as it appeared in the 1960s as we are of capitalism, and particularly its paternalistic, kind of centralized, bureaucratic, kind of the way that it looked. And if we think about what care looked like at that moment, I mean, the care homes that were being managed by the British welfare state were kind of horrific and sites of enormous abuse, actually. And so, so whilst, I've spoken about kind of community models, what often happens with the community models, whether that's kind of the feminist movement in the 70s or ACT UP in the 80s or kind of Black Panther kind of movements, is that, or Andreas likes to talk a lot about the sorts of refugee kind of care that happens in Athens, which is kind of co-organized with anarchist movements, is they disintegrate, they dissipate. And so it's absolutely vital to have a state-like structure to ensure that these sorts of democratically kind of community bottom-up initiatives endure. And so, yes, I mean, Joe talks about innovating against the state, and we're absolutely, we don't think that you can provide proper care without meshing those two levels, that you need the state to ensure these bottom-up initiatives and these more participatory forms of care kind of infrastructures kind of endure and persist, is the only thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie, that's so clear. Thank you very much. And Catherine, over to you finally.
Very briefly, first of all, thank you all and for the questions and for challenging us on various levels to think further about our work. And I just wanted to say two things basically, which is, I guess the manifesto was really thinking, as Emma and Joe and Jamie and all of you also are thinking, about what are the conditions that would enable the vast majority of us to care and to be cared for in ways that create meaningful life, right? So I think that that's an incredibly important exercise, intellectual, but also in terms of practice. And I would say that COVID, I'm not particularly optimistic about the fate of the world, but I think that one of the things that COVID has shown us is that in a blink of an eye, things can change very, very quickly. And I think that this is a moment of rupture. It has been a moment of rupture. And that means that there's a moment in which we do have, or we potentially can change things to a certain degree. At least that is something that I hold on to as we move beyond COVID. So I think that we've never been in a period in my lifetime, at least, where care has been so central to mainstream and popular discussions, as problematic as they are. And I think we also have a part to play in pushing them toward meaningful change.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a really nice note to end it on. And thank you to all our panelists and all our participants. All I can say is the books are worth getting. Emma, I don't have a hard copy of yours yet, but I have a copy of the Care Manifesto. Oh, great. Everybody can hold them up. And thank you so much. And this conversation is going to continue in many ways, and you've given us lots to really think about and bring with us in our own engagement with these issues. So thank you so much, everybody. And the video will appear on social media and other spaces in the next few days, so you can share that with people who missed the session.
And I just answered in writing
sure.
the questions that were specifically to me in the chat, because I hadn't done so, but I typed them in. Great.
Thank you, Emma. That's very helpful. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to close the session now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.